The 2024 election is right around the corner. Candidates from both sides of the aisle are going to argue passionately over healthcare, education, immigration, and more. But there's one subject where we can be sure that every candidate will speak with one unified voice.
Israel.
Israel. No candidate is likely to seriously criticize Israel, even in the midst of a massacre on Gaza, where nearly half of Israel's victims have been children.
But the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
So, why is it that a bunch of politicians who can never agree on anything else all agree on supporting Israel?
Because of AIPAC's effectiveness in carrying out its mission, you can expect that over the next several days, you will hear many fine words from elected officials describing their commitment to the U.S.-Israel relationship.
The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, is a lobbying group that advocates pro-Israel policies to the legislative and executive branches of the United States. On their website, they say that building bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel relationship is an American value that they are proud to champion. So, what does AIPAC actually do, and how does it influence foreign policy? Well, they do pretty much everything. From getting pro-Israel candidates elected, to running ad campaigns, donating millions of dollars to campaigns, actually sending candidates to Israel, launching vicious smear campaigns to stifle dissent, and more, AIPAC makes sure that Democrats and Republicans alike quake in fear before its might. Anytime a politician steps out of line and says something that could be even perceived as slightly critical towards Israel, past offenses have included recognizing the humanity of the Palestinians, mentioning the disproportionate impact that AIPAC has on Congress, and questioning the blank check American taxpayers give Israel every year. The lobby then puts millions of dollars into destroying their political career. In their book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer and Harvard Kennedy School professor Stephen Walt discuss AIPAC's disproportionate influence on U.S. foreign policy. Quote, AIPAC's success is due to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda and to punish those who challenge it. AIPAC makes sure that its friends get strong financial support from the many pro-Israel political action committees. Anyone who is seen as hostile to Israel can be sure that AIPAC will direct campaign contributions to his or her political opponents. The bottom line is that AIPAC, a de facto agent for a foreign government, has a stranglehold on Congress, with the result being that U.S. foreign policy towards Israel is not debated there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world.
Talk about AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It was incorporated in 1963. For 10 years prior to that, it was known as the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs. AIPAC calls itself America's pro-Israel lobby, and according to its website, it has over 3 million members across the country in regional chapters working to, quote, expand and strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship, end quote. You may know AIPAC as being one of the biggest and most recognizable donors to many of the members of Congress in your state. But contributing to campaigns is a relatively new function of the organization. Before 2021, AIPAC did not endorse candidates nor give political contributions. Its focus was on lobbying elected officials, not actually electing officials. But in a dramatic shift in policy, AIPAC began directly funding candidates and spending big on races in 2021. AIPAC Political Action Committee, AIPAC-PAC, filed something called a Statement of Organization with the FEC just in time for the 2022 election cycle, where it spent $50 million, including both direct contributions to candidates and outside spending like TV advertisements. According to AIPAC, it donated money to 365 candidates from both parties, including every single member of both Democratic and Republican leadership in Congress. 109 Republicans who voted against the certification of the 2020 presidential election in America received campaign contributions from AIPAC. All in all, AIPAC gave money to 342 members of the 118th Congress. The 2022 elections were the most expensive midterms in American history, with a total cost of $8.9 billion spent. Now, last year, AIPAC ranked 15th in total expenditure by a political action committee, according to data collected by Open Secrets. But take a look at the other funders that AIPAC is competing against for that title. Act Blue and Win Red. They are Democratic and Republican Party machines. Save America is Donald Trump's money-raising operation. The Conservative Club for Growth, Emily's List, focuses on electing Democratic women to office. All of the PACs on this list are massively domestic-focused ideological machines. AIPAC is the only organization in the top 20 whose interests are focused entirely on America's relationship to a foreign government. Now, let's take a look at who benefits from AIPAC's largesse. Here are the top 20 recipients in Congress, the House and the Senate, of AIPAC money in the 2022 midterm cycle, according to Open Secrets. They're members of both parties. They come from every corner of the country with varying levels of experience in Congress. The Democrat Glenn Ivey of Maryland tops the list. He beat out fellow Democrat Donna Edwards in Maryland's House primary after AIPAC poured millions into pro-Ivey advertisements and mailers. Edwards was running for a second stint in Congress after serving during the Obama administration, where she voted present, not even a no, on a number of pro-Israel resolutions. So the money poured in against her. Not even an endorsement from Nancy Pelosi could save her. Michigan Democrat Haley Stevens unseated Democratic Representative Andy Levin. Here's what Levin had to say about that.
I'm really Jewish, but AIPAC can't stand the idea that I am the clearest, strongest Jewish voice in Congress, standing for a simple proposition that there's no way to have a secure democratic homeland for the Jewish people unless we achieve the political and human rights of the Palestinian people.
AIPAC spent $4 million against Levin. He lost by 20 points. When Michigan Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress, was censured by the House in early November over what some lawmakers called her rhetoric around the Israeli-Hamas war, 22 Democrats joined Republicans in that censure vote. 18 of those Democrats received campaign funds from AIPAC in 2022, totaling more than $1.1 million. By the way, for these 6 of them, AIPAC was their top contributor. A growing list of progressive lawmakers who are vocal in their criticism of the government of Israel and its policies and their support for Palestinian self-determination have inspired AIPAC to spend even more. As progressive lawmakers began calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, Slate reported that insiders expect AIPAC's 2024 spending to hit $100 million. In fact, United Democracy Project, which is a pro-Israel super PAC affiliated with AIPAC, is already spending money on attack ads against Democratic Representatives Jamal Bowman of New York and Summer Lee of Pennsylvania. Lee has already got a primary challenger, as do Cori Bush and Ilhan Omar. Pro-Israel donors have already signaled that they are eager to primary Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Congresswoman Lee already overcame AIPAC's financial influence against her once. She tweeted criticisms of Israel's treatment of Palestinians in 2021, but as a candidate, she affirmed Israel's right to exist. But that's not good enough. AIPAC spent nearly $3 million in the primary alone to defeat Lee, and they almost did. She beat Stephen Irwin, who is third on the list of money given to candidates by AIPAC in 2022, by less than 1,000 votes.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu loves AIPAC. I mean, why wouldn't he? It's a lobby that allows his government to de facto dictate American policy. He gives directives to AIPAC, and they give directives to Congress. Politicians made all this rah-rah about Russia meddling in our elections when Israel was right there all along. So, how did we get here?
The United States has a special relationship with Israel that has no parallel in modern history, and it is almost wholly due to the lobby.
The crazy thing about U.S. aid to Israel is that it's unconditional. No matter what Israel does, that money is going through. If you're an American who pays your taxes, your money has gone to subsidize Israel's development. Israel is the largest annual recipient of U.S. foreign assistance by far, despite being a wealthy country. Since Israel's inception, the United States has provided $317 billion of U.S. taxpayer money, which has allowed Israel to have the kind of social security net Americans can only dream of, with universal health care and a robust welfare system.
The Israeli health system is among the leading health systems in the world, characterized by high efficiency, low expenses, and excellent health outcomes. As a result, infant mortality in Israel is extremely low, and Israel ranks worldwide among the highest for life expectancy.
At minimum, each year, the United States gives $3.8 billion to Israel, most of this money being in the form of military support. If we look at it in per capita terms, this level of direct foreign assistance amounts to a direct subsidy of more than $500 per year for each Israeli, the only recipient of U.S. economic aid that doesn't have to account for how it's spent. Aid to other countries is allocated for specific developmental projects, HIV/AIDS prevention, counter-narcotics programs, children's health, improving education, etc. But Israel receives a direct lump sum cash transfer. This makes it virtually impossible for the United States to prevent its subsidies from being used for the purposes that it opposes, such as building settlements on the West Bank. But money isn't the only way that we support Israel. We give Israel diplomatic protections, practical immunity in bodies like the United Nations, which are so pesky about trying to point out Israel's war crimes, human rights violations, and international law violations.
The US has faced fierce criticism for vetoing a United Nations Security Council draft resolution that called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza war. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has released a statement this morning saying that the veto makes the US complicit in what he describes as war crimes against Palestinians.
Every member of the international community is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Not on my watch. Not on my watch.
Mearsheimer and Walt write, between 1972 and 2006, Washington vetoed 42 UN Security Council resolutions that were critical of Israel. That number is greater than the combined total of all the vetoes cast by all the other Security Council members for the same period and amounts to slightly more than half of all American vetoes during these years. There were also numerous resolutions focusing on Israel that never even reached a vote in the Security Council due to the threat of an American veto. Here is an example of a UN resolution concerning Israel that the United States vetoed. UN General Assembly Resolution 59/124 on Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people. This resolution passed by a vote of 149 to 7. Among the 7 countries that opposed the resolution were the United States, Israel, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. Just this past October, the United States vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that called for humanitarian pauses in Israel's bombardment of Gaza in order to deliver life-saving aid to millions. The bulk of U.S. support is now committed to preserving Israel's military supremacy in the Middle East. Not only does Israel receive access to top-drawer U.S. weaponry, F-15 and F-16 aircraft, Black Hawk helicopters, cluster munitions, smart bombs, etc., it has also become linked to the United States defense and intelligence establishments through a diverse array of formal and informal agreements and links. U.S. military aid has helped transform Israel's armed forces into one of the most technologically sophisticated militaries in the world. Not to mention, the United States also turned a blind eye to Israel developing nuclear weapons, and now they have a sophisticated nuclear arsenal. Mearsheimer and Walt write, In contrast to Washington's long-standing opposition to the spread of weapons of mass destruction, the United States has tacitly supported Israel's efforts to maintain regional military superiority by turning a blind eye towards its various clandestine WMD programs, weapons of mass destruction, including its possession of upward of 200 nuclear weapons. In addition to its nuclear arsenal, Israel maintains active chemical and biological weapons programs and has yet to ratify either the Chemical or Biological Weapons Convention. The irony is hard to miss. The United States has pressured many other states to join the NPT, imposed sanctions on countries that have defied U.S. wishes and acquired nuclear weapons anyways, gone to war in 2003 to prevent Iraq from pursuing WMD, and contemplated attacking Iran and North Korea for the same reason. Yet, Washington has long subsidized an ally whose clandestine WMD activities are well known and whose nuclear arsenal has given several of its neighbors a powerful incentive to seek WMD themselves. We also store military supplies in Israel under the guise of being able to respond quickly to a regional crisis. The real purpose of the stockpile program is to enhance Israel's material reserves, and it is hardly surprising that an Israeli newspaper reported in December of 2006 that a great portion of American equipment stored in Israel was used for combat in the summer 2006 war in Lebanon. The United States is the world's best sugar daddy. We give them money no matter what. We don't know how they spend it. They do whatever they want, and then they ignore us. Back to the unconditional nature of the aid. In December 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon under the pretense of stopping PLO raids across its border. Instead of sanctioning Israel for invading a neighboring country, Congress voted to give Israel an additional $250 million in military assistance. Even Ronald Reagan and his Secretary of State protested. You know, if Ronald Reagan is the voice of reason, you've gone wrong. Reagan's Secretary of State wrote, quote, "In early December of 1982, I got word that a supplement was moving through the lame duck session of Congress to provide a $250 million increase in the amount of U.S. military assistance granted to Israel. This in the face of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, its use of cluster bombs, and its complicity in the Sabra and Shatila massacres. We fought the supplement and fought it hard. President Reagan and I weighed in personally, making numerous calls to senators and congressmen. On December 9th, I added a formal letter of opposition saying that the supplement appeared to endorse and reward Israel's policies. Foreign Minister Shamir called President Reagan's opposition an unfriendly act and said that it endangers the peace process. The supplement sailed right by us and was approved by Congress as though President Reagan and I had not even been there. I was astonished and disheartened. This brought home to me vividly Israel's leverage in our Congress. I saw that I must work carefully with the Israelis if I was to have any handle on congressional action that might affect Israel, and if I was to maintain congressional support for my efforts to make progress in the Middle East. This was in the 1980s, and the exact same thing is happening in Congress today. Like many instances in the modern history of the United States, the initial reasoning for viewing Israel as a strategic asset and therefore as worthy of American aid can be connected back to the fight against communism.
Mr. Nixon, what is the truth about our ability to fight the growing menace of communism?
Well, first, we must recognize communism for what it is. The only answer to communism is a massive offensive for freedom.
Mearsheimer and Walt write, "When Israel was founded in 1948, U.S. policymakers did not consider it a strategic asset. The new state was regarded as weak and potentially vulnerable, and American policymakers recognized that embracing Israel too closely would undermine the U.S. position elsewhere in the Middle East. This view changed, however, in the 1960s under the Kennedy administration, which concluded that Israel deserved more support in light of growing Soviet aid to Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. In the 70s, the famous Nixonger duo also saw increased support for Israel as an effective way to counter Soviet influence throughout the region. Watch my video on Nixonger's crimes if you're interested in that. The case of Israel's value as a strategic asset was evident. By serving as America's proxy in the Middle East, Israel helped the United States contain Soviet expansion and helped the U.S. occasionally handle other regional crises. Israel also passed on intelligence about Soviet capabilities in client states. For example, in 1956, an Israeli spy got a copy of Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin and passed it on to the U.S. However, when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the strategic reasoning for U.S. support of Israel became unclear. Did the United States support Israel after 1991 to promote peace in the Middle East? If this is the case, Israel has not been doing that. The aforementioned invasion of Lebanon in 1982 made the region less stable and led directly to the formation of Hezbollah. Israel's prolonged campaign to colonize the West Bank and Gaza, indirectly subsidized by U.S. aid and undertaken in part with U.S.-made weapons, has also produced two major uprisings in which thousands of Palestinians and Israelis have been killed. And the United States' support of Israel has increased anti-American sentiment all across the Arab world. Even when the threat of Soviet communism was alive and well, Henry Kissinger himself admitted that Israel provided little strategic value, saying, quote, "Israeli strength does not prevent the spread of communism in the Arab world, so it is difficult to claim that a strong Israel serves American interest because it prevents the spread of communism. It does not. It provides for the survival of Israel." However, another world-changing event was going to happen, and that would provide a new justification for the U.S.-Israeli partnership.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center.
La espera de mayores informaciones, saber qué fue lo que ocurrió, cómo fue que
Apparently, a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
現在私、貿易センタービルから1キロほど北にあります国連本部の
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
After the September 11 terrorist attacks, the new rationale for U.S. support of Israel was that they had a common enemy, terrorism, and the states that sponsor it. Mearsheimer and Walt write, quote, "Their hostility to Israel and the United States is said to be due to a fundamental antipathy of the West's Judeo-Christian values, its culture, and its democratic institutions. In other words, they hate Americans for what we are, not for what we do. In the same way, they hate Israel because it is also Western, modern, and democratic, and not because it has occupied Arab land, including important Islamic holy sites, and oppressed an Arab population." The Partners Against Terror line of thinking is propaganda from people who want to convince the American people that Israel's interests are identical to America's interests. There are several glaring issues with this logic, the first of which being that terrorism is not a unified phenomenon. There is no global network of highly unified terrorist groups working together to destroy Western civilization. A group like Hamas, for example, does not pose the same threat to the United States that it does to Israel. Secondly, it is not the issue of global terrorism that makes the United States support Israel. Rather, it is the United States' support of Israel that aggravates the issue of global terrorism. Let's look at some examples. The case of Ramzi Youssef, who was one of the main perpetrators of the 1993 World Trade Center and is now serving a life sentence in a U.S. prison. Youssef mailed letters to several New York newspapers taking credit for the attack and demanding that the United States terminate aid to Israel. Allegedly, he felt guilty about causing American deaths, but as Steve Cole writes in his book Ghost Wars, Youssef's remorse was, quote, overridden by the strength of his desire to stop the killing of Arabs by Israeli troops, and by his belief that bombing American targets was the only way to cause change. Osama bin Laden had similar justifications.
You have declared a jihad against the
United States. Can you tell us why?
The U.S. government has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal through its support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And we believe the U.S. is directly responsible for those killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq.
So, does U.S. support for Israel aid in the fight against terrorism? Quite the opposite. It actually increases it. Then there's the question of so-called rogue states: Iran, Iraq, Syria. Allegedly, we have a shared vital interest with Israel to make sure that these states do not acquire weapons of mass destruction. Let's think this through. What would happen if Iran acquired weapons of mass destruction? The neoconservatives would have you believe that the next day, New York, LA, and Washington would be reduced to rubble. Yet, the threat of retaliation is enough to restrain states that the United States considers to be rogue. During the Cold War, for example, the Soviets had nuclear capabilities, and yet nuclear war did not break out because the threat of extinction disincentivized using nukes against someone who has a lot of nukes. The United States has thousands of nuclear warheads. Any country that attacked it would be, as the saying goes, bombed back into the Stone Age. Let's look at some arguments on moral grounds. Allegedly, the United States should be hostile to these governments because they're dictatorships and because they violate human rights. And yet, the United States has a long history of supporting dictatorships in Latin America, in Africa. We're currently backing the Saudi monarchy in order to keep access to Gulf oil. We backed Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. As far as human rights go, this argument is paper thin. Israel is committing human rights violations against the Palestinians, and we're funding it. Then it's said that the United States should support Israel because the Jewish people have suffered great crimes. It's undeniably true that Jewish people have suffered great crimes, but as Mearsheimer and Walt put it, quote, "While there is no question that the Jews were frequently victims in Europe, in the past century, they have often been the victimizers in the Middle East, and their main victims were and continue to be the Palestinians. Not only is the basic point backed up by an abundance of evidence, but it is also intuitively plausible. After all, how could Jews coming to Palestine from Europe create a state of their own without taking harsh measures against the Arab population that already dwelt in the lands that they wanted for their new state? Just as the Europeans who created the United States and Canada could not do so without committing significant crimes against the native inhabitants, it was virtually impossible for the Zionists to carve out a Jewish state in Palestine without committing similar crimes against the local residents, who were bound to resent their encroachments and attempt to resist them. If backing the underdog was a compelling rationale, the United States would be supporting Israel's opponents." End quote. Then we have the idea that Israel is a democracy. The fact that the U.S. both historically and presently has overthrown governments that are democracies and supported governments that are dictatorships notwithstanding, according to Amnesty International, the world's leading human rights organization, Israel imposes a system of oppression and domination against Palestinians across all the areas under its control. Because Israel is an ethno-state, its leaders have long emphasized the importance of maintaining an unchallenged Jewish majority within its borders. In order to keep a Jewish majority, Israel needs to make sure that the Palestinians cannot return to their homes from before they were expelled, and to make sure that the relative birth rates of Palestinians and Jews stay at desirable rates. In early 2007, Benjamin Netanyahu apologized to ultra-Orthodox Israelis with large families for the hardship that were caused by welfare cuts that he had made in 2002 when he was finance minister. He noted, however, that there was at least one important and unexpected benefit of these cuts. There was a dramatic drop in the birth rate within the non-Jewish public. For Netanyahu, like many Israelis who are deeply worried about the so-called Arab demographic threat, the fewer Israeli Arab births, the better. There is widespread support among Israeli Jews for unequal treatment of Israeli Arabs. A poll released in March 2007 found that 55% of Israeli Jews wanted segregated entertainment facilities, while more than 75% said that they would not live in the same building as an Israeli Arab. More than half of the respondents said that for a Jewish woman to marry an Arab is equal to national treason, and 50% said that they would refuse employment if their immediate supervisor was an Arab. The Israel Democracy Institute reported in May 2003 that 53% of Israeli Jews are against full equality for the Arabs, while 77% of Israeli Jews believe that there should be a Jewish majority on crucial political decisions. Only 31% support having Arab political parties in the government. Furthermore, Israel's democratic status is further undermined by its refusal to grant the Palestinians a viable state of their own and by its continued imposition of legal, administrative, and military regimes in the occupied territories that denies Palestinians basic human rights. Israel at present controls the lives of about 3.8 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank while colonizing lands on which they have long dwelt. Specifically, Israel controls air, sea, and land access, which means that the Palestinians are effectively prisoners in Gaza, able to enter or leave only with Israeli approval. More than 32% of the land that Israel holds for the purpose of building settlements is privately owned by Palestinians. Israel intends to keep almost all of this land forever. Political Zionism began in the late 19th century. At the time, there were only about 15,000 to 17,000 Jews living in Palestine. For example, in 1893, when Palestine was under Ottoman control, Arabs comprised roughly 95% of the population. Early Zionist leaders described Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land. Unfortunately for them, the land had a people who had been in continuous possession of the territory for 1,300 years. In light of this fact, early Zionists were willing to agree on partition of the land as set forth by the United Nations, but they didn't intend to stop there. The founder of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said in 1938, quote, "After the formation of a large army in the wake of the establishment of the state, we will abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine." End quote. The early Zionists had no intention of keeping to the borders of partition. Because Arabs outnumbered Jews significantly in the territory that was to become Israel, and evidently the Arabs weren't going to give up their land voluntarily, the Israelis violently expelled large numbers of Arabs in what would come to be called the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Ben-Gurion recognized the need for expulsion in order to establish the state of Israel before it happened, writing in 1941 that, quote, "It is impossible to imagine the general evacuation of the Arab population without compulsion and brutal compulsion." In 1948, the year that Israel was established, this brutal compulsion began. Israeli forces drove up to 700,000 Palestinians into exile. Arab villages were destroyed and entire neighborhoods were emptied of their inhabitants. After the war, Israel barred the return of the Palestinian exiles. As Ben-Gurion put it in June of 1948, "We must prevent at all costs their return." So they took the land by force, violently expelled the inhabitants, and never let them return to their homes. Even Ben-Gurion recognized the gross injustice, stating, "If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true, but 2,000 years ago. And what is that to them? There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that?" The early Zionists spoke of their mission in terms of colonization. Zev Jabotinsky, the founding father of the Israeli right, wrote in 1923, "Colonization is self-explanatory, and what it implies is fully understood by every sensible Jew and Arab. There can only be one purpose in colonization. For the country's Arabs, that purpose is essentially unacceptable. This is a natural reaction, and nothing will change it. A Zionist intellectual and a close friend of Ben-Gurion's, Berl Katznetson, made the situation clear, stating, "The Zionist enterprise is an enterprise of conquest." Since Israel's inception, Israeli leaders have worked tirelessly to ensure that there is no Palestinian state. Prime Minister Golda Meir even went as far as saying that, quote, "there was no such thing as a Palestinian."
You say there is no such thing as a
East
Palestinian?
and West Bank, no.
I mean, you deny that there was a Palestine Arab people before, but there is now a Palestine liberation movement. The history of liberation movements are that they grow. Won't this one grow and become in fact, your biggest enemy?
I don't say there are no Palestinians, but I say there is no such thing as a distinct Palestinian people.
The very insightful Ben-Gurion remarked in 1937, "Were I an Arab, I would rebel even more vigorously, bitterly, and desperately against the immigration that will one day turn Palestine and all of its Arab residents over to Jewish rule." Mearsheimer and Walt write, quote, "The creation of Israel in 1948 involved explicit acts of ethnic cleansing, including executions, massacres, and rapes by Jews. They did advocate using brutal methods to remove huge numbers of Palestinians from the land that would soon be the new Jewish state. Consider what Ben-Gurion wrote in his diary on January 1st, 1948, at a time when he was involved in a series of important meetings with other Zionist leaders about how to deal with the Palestinians in their midst. There is a need now for strong and brutal reaction. We need to be accurate about timing, place, and those we hit. If we accuse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. There is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty." In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank and seized the Golan Heights, expelling upwards of 100,000 Palestinians and 80,000 Syrians. When the victims of these ethnic cleansings tried to sneak back into their homes, often unarmed, Israelis sometimes shot them on sight. Amnesty International estimates that between 1967 and 2003, Israel destroyed more than 10,000 homes in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The occupation in the West Bank and Gaza has been enforced by brute force, repression, fear, collaboration, treachery, beatings and torture chambers, and daily intimidation, humiliation, and manipulation. During the First Intifada, from 1987 to 1991, the IDF distributed truncheons to its troops and encouraged them to break the bones of Palestinian protesters. Save the Children estimated that 6,500 to 8,500 children were wounded by gunfire during the first 2 years of the Intifada. Regarding the 106 recorded cases of child gunshot deaths, the report concluded that almost all of them were hit by directed, not random or ricochet, gunfire. Almost 20% suffered multiple gunshot wounds. About 12% were shot from behind. 15% of the children were 10 years or younger. Most of the children were not participating in a stone-throwing demonstration when shot, and nearly 1/5 of the children were shot dead while at home or within 10 meters of their home. In light of these grave injustices, why does the United States support Israel?
America's most powerful Jewish lobby holds its annual conference, but many claim that power is the reason for a biased US foreign policy in the Middle East that always favors Israel. So, is AIPAC damaging America's image abroad? And are cracks emerging within the group? This is Inside Story.
National interest in the United States is shaped by interest groups. Their job is to lobby politicians in the name of the people that they represent. The groups that have the most money have the greatest influence, so legislation is passed with these groups in mind. Sometimes legislation is even written by these groups. Unfortunately, these groups can work in ways that are antithetical to the country's national interest. The National Rifle Association, for example, has lobbied extensively against gun control in a country with the most school shootings in the world. Oil and gas lobbies have spent millions of dollars discrediting reports on the connection between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. AIPAC is just like these other lobbies. They spend millions of dollars to make sure that politicians support Israel.
In the 2018 midterm elections, more than $14.9 million was raised by pro-Israel groups for candidates. That's their third biggest contribution ever. Out of 435 members of the House of Representatives, 269 received pro-Israel lobby contributions at an average of more than $23,000 per representative. And out of 100 U.S. senators, 58 accepted contributions at an average of more than $77,000 per senator.
There are other pro-Israel PACs, but none of them are as influential as AIPAC. They're a Washington powerhouse. Inside of AIPAC, a small number of wealthy conservatives dominate. Membership on AIPAC's board of directors is determined by how much money you give, so evidently, the people who give the most are the most hawkish, hardline fanatics. AIPAC isn't representative of the views of American Jews, but rather the most right-wing stances. For example, only 38% of American Jews believe that the Israeli government is sincerely pursuing peace, and 44% believe that the construction of new settlements damages Israel's national security. Yet, AIPAC is opposed to making U.S. aid to Israel conditional on any basis. As an AIPAC spokesman explained in June of 2000, when concerns about Israel's arms sales to China led to calls for a reduction in U.S. support, quote, "We are opposed to linking Israel's aid under any circumstances because once it starts, it never stops." The lobby is made up of neoconservatives and Christian Zionists. The neocons believe that the United States is the leader of the free world, and they view U.S. leadership as both good for America and good for the world. They're war hawks. They believe the use of force and the military to exert American hegemony will result in prosperity, at home and abroad. Using force, anyone who doesn't agree with us will be scared into submission, and our allies will follow our lead. Not too unsimilar from the way that AIPAC functions. Then there's the Christian Zionists. It's exactly what it sounds like. They believe that supporting Israel is God's will. They're a part of the larger Christian right. So, why is the Israel lobby so effective? Mearsheimer and Walt write, "One reason is the wide-open nature of the American political system. The United States has a divided form of government, a well-established tradition of free speech, and a system in which elections are very expensive to run and where campaign contributions are weakly regulated. This environment gives different groups many different ways to gain access or influence policy. Interest groups can direct campaign contributions to favored candidates and try to defeat candidates whose views are suspect. They can also lobby elected representatives and members of the executive branch, and they can try to get their own supporters appointed to key policymaking positions. Moreover, there are numerous ways for interest groups to mold public opinion. By cultivating sympathetic journalists, writing books, articles, and op-eds, working to discredit or marginalize anyone with different views, and more. For a group that is highly motivated and has sufficient resources, there is no shortage of ways to influence public policy. AIPAC also doesn't really have any effective opposition. The Israel lobby states, "Although Arab Americans are a significant minority, they are neither as wealthy, well-organized, numerous, or politically active as Jewish Americans. As a group, Arab Americans have not been as successful in reaching prominent positions in academia, business, and the media, and they are also less visible in politics. This is partly because the main waves of Arab immigration to the United States occurred relatively recently, and first-generation immigrants are less affluent, less represented in important positions, less familiar with American mores and institutions, less active in politics, and therefore less influential than subsequent generations tend to be. As Harry Truman famously remarked, "In all of my political experience, I don't ever recall the Arab vote swinging a close election." Let's talk about how AIPAC influences foreign policy. Congressional lobbying. AIPAC's chokehold on Congress cannot be overstated. It screens potential candidates and arranges meetings with potential donors and fundraisers, and provides information to the growing number of pro-Israel PACs. Funds are contributed to campaigns on the criterion of unwavering support for Israel. Former AIPAC President Howard Friedman told the organization's members in 2006, quote, "AIPAC meets with every candidate running for Congress. These candidates receive in-depth briefings to help them completely understand the complexities of Israel's predicament and that of the Middle East as a whole. We even ask each candidate to author a position paper on their views of the U.S.-Israel relationship, so it's clear where they stand on the subject." End quote. Congress members are afraid of AIPAC, and for good reason. When former Senator Adlai Stevenson from Illinois introduced an amendment to a Senate bill that called for reducing foreign aid to Israel if it did not stop building settlements, AIPAC got to work immediately. According to Stevenson, he and his wife were, quote, reviled as anti-Semitic. Some in the press turned hostile. Jewish friends and supporters were also reviled. In his bid for governor, he was narrowly defeated, stating that, quote, the lobby made the difference in that election many times over. And it's not just Senator Stevenson. Congressman Jim Moran got the AIPAC special as well.
In 2002, AIPAC was lobbying Moran to vote for the invasion of Iraq.
The executive director of AIPAC said that his most important accomplishment was securing the authorization for the use of U.S. military force in Iraq. AIPAC was pushing it very hard.
Why does AIPAC benefit from the United States going to war?
The United States getting involved in wars in the Middle East is ultimately in Israel's interests, because we have a stake in the region.
Congressman Moran refused to vote for the invasion, as AIPAC requested.
There are compelling, fundamental reasons why this body should oppose this resolution.
Then at a public meeting, he was asked a question.
A Jewish woman actually stood up in a town hall. She said, why aren't more Jews involved in the marches against the war? I said, if the leaders of the Jewish community were opposed to the war, I think that would make a difference.
The lobby reacted, claiming this was evidence of Moran's belief in a Jewish conspiracy that was leading America to war.
There was a conservative rabbi in my district who was assigned to me, I assume, by AIPAC. And he had warned me that if I voiced my views about the Israeli lobby, that my career would be over, and implied that it would be done through the Post. And sure enough, the Washington Post editorialized brutally. Everybody ganged up.
So what are the main outlets that TIP work with?
Washington Post is the biggest one.
Okay. Isn't that like just down there or something?
Yeah, it's actually that building.
Moran claims the Washington Post's editorial board has a close relationship with AIPAC.
The principal editorial board of the Post itself has been a very effective instrument because they've been able to maintain their credibility. And it's a great paper in every other way, but because they have such credibility, they're extremely effective.
Everyone knew he wasn't anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism has come to mean anti-Israel. The AIPAC crowd doesn't really care very much about whether or not a person likes Jews or wants one to move next door. All they care about is what their position is on Israel.
Both of my daughters married Jewish men. My grandchildren are Jewish. Anybody that considers me anti-Semite is ignorant.
Creating pro-Israel presidents. Not only does AIPAC get pro-Israel candidates elected, but they also turn candidates who had previous criticisms of Israel into die-hard supporters. Take Hillary Clinton, for example, whose support for Palestinian statehood in 1998 and public embrace of the wife of Yasser Arafat in 1999 provoked strong criticism from groups in the lobby. Yet, when Clinton ran for office herself, she became an ardent defender of Israel and received ample financial support from the lobby. In Congress, criticizing Israel is tantamount to political suicide. Former President Jimmy Carter said as much in 2007, stating that, "I don't see any present prospect that any member of the U.S. Congress, the House, or Senate would say, let's take a balanced position between Israel and the Palestinians and negotiate a peace agreement." He added, "It's almost politically suicidal for a member of the Congress who wants to seek re-election to take any stand that may be interpreted as anti-policy of the conservative Israeli government."
Americans don't want to know
And many Israelis don't want to know what is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution that far transcends what any outsider would imagine. And there are powerful political forces in America that prevents any objective analysis of the problem in the Holy Land. I think it's accurate to say that not a single member of Congress with whom I'm familiar would possibly speak out and call for Israel to withdraw to their legal boundaries or to publicize the plight of the Palestinians. And that is added on to by the very effective work of the American-Israeli group called AIPAC, which is performing its completely legitimate task of convincing Americans to support the policies of the Israeli government. And AIPAC is not dedicated to peace. They're dedicated to inducing the maximum support in America, in the White House, in the Congress, and in the public media.
But AIPAC's influence on Capitol Hill goes even further. AIPAC doesn't only influence policy, it creates it. Mearsheimer and Walt write, lobbying groups of all types exercise influence not merely by direct persuasion and by using campaign contributions to gain access, but also by providing a legislative subsidy to sympathetic lawmakers and supplying overworked staffs with direct assistance in analyzing issues, framing legislation, and offering talking points and speeches to give to constituents. Not only does every member of Congress receive AIPAC's biweekly newsletter, Near East Report, its personnel are also available to help staffers when issues affecting Israel arise. According to Douglas Bloomfield, a former AIPAC staff member, quote, "It is common for members of Congress and their staffs to turn to AIPAC first when they need information, before calling the Library of Congress, the Congressional Research Service, committee staff, or administration experts." More important, he notes that AIPAC is often called upon to draft speeches, work on legislation, advise on tactics, perform research, collect co-sponsors, and marshal votes. In other words, AIPAC inserts itself directly into the legislative and policymaking process with considerable frequency. Mearsheimer and Walt write, the bottom line is that AIPAC, which bills itself as America's pro-Israel lobby, has an almost unchallenged hold on Congress. One of the three main branches of the American government is firmly committed to supporting Israel. Open debate about U.S. policy towards Israel does not occur there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world. As Senator Ernest Hollings noted as he was leaving office in 2004, you can't have an Israeli policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here. But wait, there's more. AIPAC wins when it's able to get people into important positions in the government. On a secretly taped phone call with former AIPAC president David Steiner, Steiner admitted that he had personally met to cut a deal with the Secretary of State James Baker for $3 billion in foreign aid to Israel, plus $1 billion in other goodies that people don't even know about. He also said, "We have a dozen people in Clinton's campaign, in the headquarters, and they're all going to get big jobs." So we have it on good authority that AIPAC has allies in key appointments of each administration. But AIPAC's influence doesn't stop in government. They work hard to shape discourse about Israel in the media. They help inform the Overton window and set the limits of acceptable speech in media, think tanks, and academia. An essential part of maintaining positive public attitudes towards Israel is to make sure that mainstream media's coverage of Israel and the Middle East consistently favors Israel and does not call U.S. support into question in any way. When compared with news coverage in other democracies, America's news coverage of Israel tends to be strongly biased in Israel's favor. Two of the most popular daily newspapers in the United States, the New York Times and the Washington Post, both favor Israel. For example, in his memoirs, former Times executive editor Max Frankel recounted the impact his own pro-Israel attitudes had on his editorial choices. Quote, I was much more deeply devoted to Israel than I dared to assert. Fortified by my knowledge of Israel and my friendships there, I myself wrote most of our Middle East commentaries. As more Arab than Jewish readers recognized, I wrote them from a pro-Israel perspective.
We are out here in response to the global call for strike.
Over the past 2 months, Israel and the United States have killed 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza. They have committed unspeakable crimes. And we're here in front of the New York Times because the New York Times is not just complicit, it is responsible. The New York Times is manufacturing consent for genocide, and we're here to say shame! Shame!
To further discourage unfavorable writing on Israel, AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups organize letter-writing campaigns, demonstrations, and boycotts against news outlets who are critical of Israel. This isn't the age-old Jews control the media conspiracy theory. Like previously said, most Jewish Americans aren't even in line with the lobby.
If you poll the Jewish community, which J Street has done every election night since our founding, you'll see that, in fact, a majority of American Jews support pushing for a Palestinian state alongside a secure Israel.
The politicians are scared of AIPAC.
Also, members of both parties worried about crossing the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, a powerful bipartisan lobbying organization dedicated to ensuring unwavering U.S. support for Israel. AIPAC's clout could be brought to bear on virtually every congressional district in the country, and just about every politician in Washington, including me, counted AIPAC members among their key supporters and donors. In the past, the organization had accommodated a spectrum of views on Middle East peace, insisting mainly that those seeking its endorsement support a continuation of U.S. aid to Israel and oppose efforts to isolate or condemn Israel via the UN and other international bodies. But as Israeli politics had moved to the right, so had AIPAC's policy positions. Its staff and leaders increasingly argued that there should be, quote, no daylight between the U.S. and Israeli governments, even when Israel took actions that were contrary to U.S. policy. Those who criticized Israeli policy too loudly risked being tagged as anti-Israel and possibly anti-Semitic, and confronted with a well-funded opponent in the next election.
The president is scared of AIPAC. Even the journalists are scared of AIPAC. Free and vibrant democracy indeed.
The pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, used to be bipartisan, but these days it's got a super PAC that has spent very heavily in Democratic primaries.
Against progressives.
You said they're doing everything they can to destroy the progressive movement in this country. Do you think the politics around this issue are constraining the White House going into 2024?
The way I look at AIPAC now in terms of their political activities, this is not even just the pro-Israel group. This is a corporate PAC, sometimes getting money from Republicans, sometimes supporting extreme right-wing Republicans. So what really upset me very much is that in many of these primaries, we had great candidates, young people, often people of color, and you had AIPAC and other super PACs spending millions of dollars trying to defeat them. And as you may know, I tried to get the Democratic Party to pass a resolution that in Democratic primaries, super PAC money should not be allowed to be used.
Academia. Academia is a key battleground for the Israel lobby. College campuses, with their commitment to free speech and intellectual debate, have come under fire at present times and historically. Since the 1970s, AIPAC has monitored campus activity and trained young advocates for Israel. When Israel comes under fire, AIPAC increases spending dramatically on college campuses. According to Jonathan Kessler, the former director of leadership development at AIPAC, the reason for these efforts is to vastly expand the number of students involved on campus, their competence, and their involvement in the national pro-Israel effort. In the 1980s, AIPAC even went as far as recruiting students to help identify professors and campus organizations that might be considered anti-Israel. The findings were published in 1984 in the AIPAC College Guide, exposing the anti-Israel campaign on campus. Mearsheimer and Walt write, The various strategies that groups in the lobby employ are mutually reinforcing. If politicians know that it is risky to question Israeli policy or the United States' unyielding support for Israel, then it will be harder for the mainstream media to locate authoritative voices that are willing to disagree with the lobby's view. If public discourse about Israel can be shaped so that most Americans have generally positive impressions of the Jewish state, then politicians will have even more reason to follow the lobby's lead. Today is the 100th day of Israel's bombing of Gaza. As of today, January 14th, 2024, 23,843 Palestinians have been killed. An estimated 70% of those deaths are women and children. 1.9 million Palestinians are displaced in Gaza. This in response to the Hamas attack on October 7th, which killed 1,139 Israelis. The justification for this massacre is that Hamas is using civilians as human shields, that Hamas is hiding in tunnels under hospitals, and that Hamas is a terrorist organization that needs to be exterminated. The claims about human shields and tunnels under hospitals are the same that were used in Israel's war on Lebanon and Hezbollah, and were ultimately proven untrue by Amnesty International. Netanyahu says that Hamas is a bloodthirsty terrorist organization that kills innocent people. Yet terrorism was one of the key tactics that the Zionists used when they were in a similarly weak position and trying to obtain their own state. With 76 years of brutal occupation and no Palestinian state in sight, Israel has created the conditions for violent resistance. As former Prime Minister Barak stated clearly, had he been born a Palestinian, he would have joined a terrorist organization.
There's a difference between going after Hamas and punishing on purpose the civilian population. Those are two different things. If you go after Hamas, if you're the Israelis and you go after Hamas, there is going to be a significant amount of collateral damage, which is to say a lot of civilians are going to be killed. That's inevitable. And it's in large part because Hamas is woven into the civilian population. But the Israelis are not simply going after Hamas. What the Israelis are doing is they are purposely killing huge numbers of civilians. And the evidence for this is overwhelming. And the evidence comes from inside Israel itself. If you look at the statements that Israeli leaders are making, and if you look at the assessments of the bombing campaign that are coming from inside Israel and are well done assessments, it's quite clear that this is a classic punishment campaign where the aim is to kill large numbers of civilians. And I believe, and there is a good amount of evidence to support this, that what the Israelis are interested in doing in the end is ethnically cleansing Gaza. I believe the Israelis would like to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and they would like to ethnically cleanse the West Bank. They'd like to get rid of the Palestinians.
And just as in the case of the Lebanon War, the indiscriminate killings of civilians in the name of a war against terror does nothing but proliferate violence. And mind you, this is how Hamas arose in the first place. Israel says that it doesn't negotiate with terrorists, yet it didn't negotiate in good faith with peace-loving people either. But wherever there is oppression, there will be resistance. And people all over the world are protesting Israeli apartheid, Jews and Gentiles alike.
This is New York's famous Grand Central Station, and you can see banners reading, "Palestinians should be free."
Thousands of members of Jewish Voice for Peace and their allies shut down the main terminal of Grand Central Station during rush hour. 400 people were arrested in what's believed to be the largest sit-in protest New York has seen in over 2 decades.
This is the Jewish Voice for Peace. They support the protests. They've been calling for a ceasefire.
The turnout is massive.
thousands of New Yorkers united in a call for peace.
At one point, there were so many protesters, the terminal was closed.
The group, made up mostly of Jewish New Yorkers, is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Wearing T-shirts that read, "Not in our name."
Right now, you are hearing thousands of Jewish New Yorkers who are raising our voices, so clear that our safety can never come at the expense of another community's safety.
President Biden and Blinken, listen to what people are telling you, especially the young people and lots of Jews.
While the group comprised mostly of Jewish activists, people from all backgrounds were here.
I'm here because the U.S. government is funding the bombardment, the indiscriminate bombing of 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza who have no access to fuel, have no access to medical supplies. Their hospitals are being bombed, their schools are being bombed. There is nowhere to go.
What's happening to Palestinians has been happening for decades, and it must end now.
Sources say NYPD arrested close to 300 people, possibly more.
It's been a pretty extraordinary night inside Grand Central Terminal. Take a look right behind me here. Members of that Jewish activist group standing on a ledge next to the departure sign. You've got the NYPD trying to get them down. This was sort of reminiscent of a protest back in 1991 when members of ACT UP went on that ledge and protested. So what you're watching right now are members of the Jewish Voice for Peace being taken into custody. They are demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. And for the most part, it's been pretty peaceful here.
My Jewish tradition teaches me that life is precious. And that is why so many of us are doing all that we can to try to save lives in Gaza, to call for an immediate ceasefire so that Gaza can live.
على عهدي على ديني على أرض تلاقيني أنا لأهلي أنا فديهم أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني